So the first neo-noir movie I'll be taking a look at happens to be one of the biggest and most famous such films of all time. I'm referring to the 1974 film Chinatown. The story about the story. Before I get into any of the people or the history behind Chinatown, I'd first like to answer a question that applies to all three of these final films. What is neo-noir, and how is it different from the original flavor? Answering that question is kind of difficult since, to be perfectly frank, it's also hard to describe noir. Ordinarily, genres are defined by their subject matter or their setting, things that are perfectly obvious and easy to point to. Comedies have jokes, dramas are serious and realistic, science fiction is full of currently unknown technology, westerns take place in the American West, thrillers are about spies, secrets, and high stakes, musicals have the characters burst into song regularly, and so on and so on. So what's noir? Noir is a mood. Noir has a cinematography style that reinforces that mood, except not all noirs have great cinematography. Noir is about detectives, private or police, except that not all noirs feature detectives. Noir has femme fatales, except not all female leads backstab the male protagonist. Noir is full of punchy, witty dialogue, except for all the films where people talk more or less normally. Noir is characterized by its jaded narrator, except for all the movies that don't have one. So to sum it all up, noir has a mood, and it has a few tropes you can use, and that's about it. The fact is that most, if not all, films we now call noir were called something else by the people who made them. They were thrillers, hard-boiled detective stories, gangster movies, dramas, and at least in one case, a docudrama. They weren't checking noir cliches off a list, they were cribbing ideas from each other, and they didn't make sure to have each one in each film. Because of all this, defining neo-noir is even harder. There are still a few ways to differentiate it. First, there's the cultural backdrop. Whether it's a period piece or contemporary, the culture of Hollywood changes right along with the rest of the United States. Culture, more than anything else, defines what a film can and can't cover. Plus, if nothing else, films made in the 60s and later didn't have to worry about the Hays Code. Second, there's the rise of color film. The rules of cinematography change significantly once you switch to widescreen color. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there's the self-awareness. Noir as a concept probably didn't exist in Hollywood until the 1960s. But after that, filmmakers intentionally started to make noir films. Moving on to the movie at hand, Chinatown is actually an original fictional screenplay which is loosely based on the real history of Los Angeles. One of the characters, Hollis Mulwray, is based on William Mulholland, the man who designed and built the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which directs water from the Owens River to what's otherwise a city in the desert. The aqueduct wasn't very popular with the farmers living in the Owens River Valley, since they gradually lost all their water and had to leave. In 1928, at the tail end of a conflict known as the California Water Wars, the St. Francis Dam, a part of the aqueduct, broke apart and killed an estimated 600 people. Mulholland was eventually cleared of charges of criminal negligence, but this disaster still marked the end of his career. The last thing I'd like to bring up before I begin the story is the director, Roman Polanski. Polanski is famous for creating films with dark and sometimes outright evil themes. Movies like Ghostwriter, The Pianist, The Ninth Gate, and of course today's film. And once you read his biography, it's easy to see why. His life has been a shit show. He was a 5-year-old boy living in Poland when the Nazis arrived and took his parents to the concentration camps, basically making him a refugee within his own country for the next 6 years. 2 decades later, after Polanski had grown up and moved to Hollywood, he married Sharon Tate, a woman who is around 10 years younger than him. A year and a half after their marriage, in 1969, the madman Charles Manson and his brainwashed crew broke into Polanski's home while he was away in Europe and murdered his wife, plus 4 of his friends. Then, in 1977, Polanski was charged with sexually abusing a 13-year-old girl. He agreed to a plea bargain that would put him on probation, but he then found out the judge was going to sentence him to jail and try and get him deported. So Polanski got ahead of things and fled to France, which is where he's lived ever since. And now that last bit of trouble was of Polanski's own making, but at the same time, his life is still one incredible shit show. The story. We start in black and white, but that's actually a ruse. Turns out we're looking at a man looking at photographs of his cheating wife. The year is 1937. The detective who took the photos is Jake Gittes, played by Jack Nicholson. He gives his client Curly some whiskey to soothe the pain. They then discuss the payment, and Jack promises that Curly can pay him later. His next client is already waiting with a couple of his operatives, Mrs. Mulray. She suspects her husband is cheating on her, and although Jake warns her that she might not want to know the truth, she insists on finding out. When she mentions her husband is Hollis Mulray, chief engineer of LA's Water and Power Department, Jake hesitates, but Mrs. Mulray promises to pay whatever he asks for. We next see Jake sitting at a public meeting about a proposed Alto Vallejo dam, which would create a new reservoir for the city. Mulray speaks against the proposal, saying the ground at the proposed dam site is too similar to the ground beneath the failed Van der Lip Dam. Then a shepherd brings his flock to the meeting as a stunt, shouting about water theft ruining the valley's grazing. Later on, Jack watches as Mulray meets with a young boy on a horse in a mostly dry riverbed and then looks through a big blueprint folder. Jake then shadows Mulray to an empty beach. Just after the sun sets, a nearby pipe starts dumping tons of water. A few days pass, but it seems like all Mulray is interested in is his job, and the best Jake's operatives can do is take pictures of him arguing with an old man. But then, one of them spots Mulray with a woman in Glendale, and so Jake heads down himself to take pictures. After that, he sneaks onto the roof of an apartment complex to take more. The next day, the pictures are all over the front page. When he gets back to his office, there's a new woman waiting for him, Mrs. Evelyn Mulray, the real Mrs. Mulray, played by Faye Dunaway. She's understandably upset that the Gittes agency spied on her husband supposedly for her sake, and before Jake can explain what happened, she basically says, "I'll see you in court," and leaves. Jake heads to Mr. Mulray's office, talks his way past the secretary, and starts snooping through Mulray's things. He discovers from a picture that the real Mrs. Mulray is indeed the second one, and on the meeting table he spots the folder from earlier with a note. Tuesday night, Oak Pass Reservoir, 7 channels used. The deputy head of the department, Yelburton, shows up to talk with Jake, and Jake uses this as an opportunity to steal several of his business cards. Then, on his way out, he meets and insults Claude Mulvihill, a former sheriff who now works as security for the water department. Since Mulray wasn't at his office, Jake heads to his very green estate, using the deputy's card as a reference to get in. In the backyard, Jake notices a small pond and a Chinese groundskeeper complaining about glass. He then spots something shining in the pond, but before he can retrieve it, Evelyn shows up in a horse-riding outfit. At this point, Jake explains that he's been had too, and Evelyn pulls a complete 180 and promises to drop the lawsuit immediately. However, Jake doesn't want to drop it. Someone screwed him, and he intends to find out who. He mentions that Mr. Mulray's girlfriend disappeared, and maybe Mulray disappeared with her, and if Evelyn knows where he is, Jake can help him. Evelyn acts rather nervously at this point, and she tells Jake to look for Mulray at one of the local reservoirs. At the reservoir, Jake gets past the police cordon with another of those business cards, and he discovers his old friend Lou Escobar investigating a death. Mulray's. He was found dead at the base of a runoff channel. Lou suspects that he either slipped or committed suicide. When she's later interviewed, Evelyn slips up a bit regarding the whole private investigation thing, and so Jake covers for her to keep that particular incident out of the official report. After she leaves, Jake speaks with the coroner and hears about a hobo who drowned in the dry LA River at around the same spot where Jake saw Mulray. Jake heads back to take a closer look, and he finds the same boy from earlier riding the same horse. From him, he learns that someone's been dumping water into the river every evening. Jake then heads back to the Oak Pass Reservoir, gets shot at, almost drowns when someone dumps water down the runoff channel, and then gets accosted by Mulvihill and Roman Polanski. Seriously, that short guy with the knife who cuts Jake's nose is played by the movie's director. The next morning, Jake is sporting a massive bandage and has a clear goal: to sue the shit out of whoever hired those goons. He gets a call from someone named Ida Sessions, who identifies herself as the woman who impersonated Mrs. Mulray at the movie's beginning. She's coming forward because of what happened to Mulray, and although she's too scared to name her employers, she asks Jake to read the day's obituaries to find one of those people. Jake and Evelyn meet over lunch to discuss what's been going on. Jake suspects Evelyn knows more than she's letting on, and so she tells him that she's been having numerous short affairs of her own, and that's why she acted strangely before. She also has an oddly hard time saying her maiden name, Cross. Jake heads back to the LAWPD office and notices a name on the wall, Noah Cross. He then annoys the secretary for a while and finds out from her that Noah Cross and Mulray once owned the entire water supply of Los Angeles. Until Mulray sold it to the city, that is. When Jake speaks with Yelburton, he lays out his theory that the deputy director was behind everything: the fake Mrs. Mulray, the water dumping, and Mulray's death. Yelburton tells him that it's runoff from water they're diverting to orange groves in the Northwest Valley, but Jake just gives him his card and promises to keep him out of trouble if he helps Jake nail the men who are really responsible for the whole conspiracy. When Jake gets back to his office, Evelyn is already there. She wants to hire him to find her husband's killers, and when Jake asks her about her father and her husband's shared history, she has an oddly hard time even mentioning her father. But according to her, they fell out after the dam disaster and haven't spoken since. Jake decides to see for himself, so he goes to meet Noah Cross at his holy shit, that is John Huston. That is John motherfucking Huston sitting right there. Right, so, as I was saying, they chat about the case for a while, and Noah says that he's worried that Jake is taking his daughter for a ride, since the official report says Mulray's death was accidental. Noah then offers to double Jake's fee if he finds Mulray's missing girlfriend for him. Finally, Jake brings up the argument Noah had with Mulray, which is what those pictures from earlier were about. Noah admits that they argued about his daughter, and Jake accepts the contract. Jake then heads over to the Los Angeles Hall of Records to find out who owns the land in the Northwest Valley. He notices that many of the owners are recent buyers, since their names are pasted in. The clerk won't let Jake check out the volume, naturally, so instead he tears the page out, covering it with a cough. He then heads out to the orange groves, where the farmers start shooting at him. They knock out his radiator and one of his tires. When he crashes, two farmhands start beating him up. Finally, the man in charge calms everyone down and asks Jake who he's working for, since they've had men from the water department poisoning their wells and redirecting their water. Jake tells them that he's working for Evelyn Mulray, but he insults them in the process, and so they knock him out. When Jake comes to, Evelyn is there to pick him up. He explains to her that the proposed dam is a con job, that a few people have been intimidating the farmers off their land so they can buy it for peanuts and then irrigate it with the new reservoir. It's at this point that he pulls out the obituary from earlier and realizes that one of the names is indeed familiar. And when compared to the land ownership file, it means that someone bought farmland a week after he died. The two head over to the rest home where the man in question spent his final days, talk their way in, and then see from an activity board that the rest of the landowners are also living here. Speaking with a couple of the residents, Jake hears about a connection to the Albacore Club, which happens to be connected in turn to Noah's estate. And then Mulvihill shows up again. Jake takes him by surprise and kicks his ass. Just before his reinforcements can do anything, Evelyn speeds by in her car and Jake jumps in. Jake and Evelyn unwind at her house with a few stiff drinks. Jake starts reminiscing about Chinatown, which is where he worked as a DA's investigator for several years, doing, as he calls it, as little as possible. They tend to Jake's wounded nose, they start flirting, and then they have sex. Afterwards, Jake talks some more about Chinatown, and he mentions that he once tried to keep a woman there from being hurt, but in the process, he ensured that she was. Their pillow talk is interrupted by an emergency phone call. While Evelyn swears it has nothing to do with anything else, Jake knocks out one of her rear headlights so he can follow her in the dark. Sure enough, she leads him to a small residence where her Chinese manservant is confining Mulray's distraught girlfriend. Jake confronts Evelyn in her car, and at length she finally explains that the woman is her sister, Catherine, and she implies that she set Catherine and her husband up together so that he could be happy. Seeing that she's upset, Jake decides to leave her be after that. Just before Jake can get to sleep, the phone rings. A man says Ida Sessions wants to see him at a certain address, but Jake is too tired to bother going. He stops by the address the next morning, though, and he discovers that someone has broken in and killed the poor woman. It was probably the man on the phone, and thus Jake's laziness either saved his life or kept him from getting framed for the murder. In fact, Lou has been waiting for him to do something incriminating in the bathroom. Lou has a few ideas about what's really going on, but Jake gives him nothing. Lou thinks Jake has pictures of Evelyn killing her husband, and that's why she's been paying him since then. He also mentions that Mulray had salt water in his lungs, an odd thing to find in a man who supposedly drowned in a reservoir. Jake lets Lou in on his own conspiracy theory, but of course the police don't believe him. Instead, they tell him to bring Evelyn in to the station in 2 hours. Jake heads back to the Mulray estate to warn Evelyn, but he finds the maid packing all of her things for a long trip. As he's looking around, he meets the old Chinese groundskeeper again, who says, "Salt water very bad for glass." Turns out he meant to say grass, and he's talking about their saltwater pond. Jake spots the shiny thing again, and the groundskeeper fishes it out. Turns out it's a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. Jake races back to the suburban home and calls Lou right away. Jake confronts Evelyn with the glasses and demands to know what's going on, and in particular, who the girl is. This time Evelyn says she's her daughter, so Jake slaps her. This is where that famous bit comes from. "She's my sister. She's my daughter. My sister. My daughter." Turns out both answers are correct. Her father raped her when she was very young, and the girl, Catherine, is the result. She ran away to Mexico to have the baby, and she left her daughter behind when Mulray took her in. She wants to flee back to Mexico with her daughter, and so Jake advises her to just take the girl and run. She also mentions that the glasses aren't Mulray's since he didn't wear bifocals. Evelyn tells Jake that she'll be hiding out in another house in Chinatown, which for Jake means bad memories. As she leaves, Jake calls his operatives and tells them to meet him in Chinatown also. When Lou shows up, Jake tells him that they were both too late, and although he offers a new address, Lou insists that they'll go together. So Jake takes him to a new location that turns out to be Curly's place. Since Curly still owes him from earlier, he gets him to sneak Jake out in his truck and then take Evelyn's luggage down to Chinatown. Jake then calls Noah Cross to bring him down to his daughter's house. He tells Noah about the glasses and the obituary, and Noah happily tells him that he's behind the sabotage and the new dam, and that he plans to expand the city into the Northwest Valley to cover it all up. As for the whole incest thing, Noah only says that Most people never have to face the fact that at the right time and the right place, they're capable of anything. Noah then has his flunky Mulvihill take the broken glasses from Jake at gunpoint, and then they all head to Chinatown. When they get there, Jake's associates are waiting, but they've been handcuffed together. Lou found them first, and he's arresting basically everybody. Jake tries to shout that Noah is crazy, is behind everything, but Lou doesn't want to listen. Evelyn and Catherine come out to the car soon after, and Noah tries to speak with his daughter/granddaughter, while Evelyn tries to push him away. Evelyn pulls a gun out, and when Noah keeps trying to get close to Catherine, she shoots him in the shoulder. Evelyn starts to drive off after that, and the cops wind up shooting her dead. Catherine starts screaming, Noah takes her away, and Lou decides to uncuff everybody. As the movie ends, Jake mutters, "As little as possible," and Lou screams at his associates to take him home. One of those associates has the last word. "Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown." Final thoughts. You know, there is a reason why Chinatown takes place roughly 10 to 20 years after the actual California water wars. It's likely due to the fact that the 1930s was the most corrupt decade in Los Angeles history. If you think it's bad today, if you think it was bad in the 90s, that's because you don't know about James E. Davis. Davis became the chief of police in 1926, promising to create gun squads that would kill rum runners and free the city of the grip of prohibition crime. And he did institute the first mandatory police firearm training and the first dragnet systems, but in the process, the LA Police Department started murdering people in the streets, kept a tally for each officer's kills, and wound up getting involved in politics by acting as enforcers for Davis's favorite politicians. In 1929, Davis was ousted from the job following a major scandal, but in 1933, Frank Shaw got elected mayor and put Davis back in his old position. Between the two of them, Los Angeles became a place where you could literally say the criminals are running City Hall. And I don't mean that they went in for the under-the-table bribes or influence peddling or any of that shit we'd point to today. This was a time when the LAPD Vice Squad was literally in charge of the city's vice. Remember Guy McAfee? And the rest of the police were basically the enforcers for a crime boss who happened to sit in the mayor's chair and call his extortion taxes. Remember this for the future. Whenever a politician says he's tough on crime, he only means he's tough on everyone else's crime. James Davis cleared out the department when he returned, supposedly to root out corruption, but actually to make sure that his brand of corruption would stick. He then created the Red Squad and turned them loose on communists, socialists, and unions, declaring at one point that communists have no constitutional rights and I won't listen to anyone who defends them. During the Dust Bowl, Davis sent officers to assist with border patrol when the state illegally closed its borders to migrant workers. Meanwhile, Mayor Shaw's brother Joe sold jobs and promotions in the police department to the highest bidders. And of course, the LA Times was covering none of this because its editor-in-chief was as much a part of the corruption as everyone else. The end began in 1937, when the administration tapped a restaurateur named Clifford Clinton to run a restaurant inspection. Clinton found widespread graft and bribery where health inspections should have been, and when his report went ignored, he realized the corruption ran all the way to the top. He would eventually organize Civic, the Citizens Independent Vice Investigating Committee, which would slowly but surely bring all this corruption to light. Clinton was aided by a disgraced former police detective, Harry Raymond, and Judge Fletcher Bowron, who managed to bypass the mayor's authority to make sure Civic's report would see the light of day. The end of the end came in 1938, when the efforts to silence Clinton turned violent. After several beatings, a smear campaign by the Times, tax hikes, sabotage, and a couple firebombs, the LAPD's Red Squad blew up Harry Raymond's car, and Raymond survived. He managed to provide court testimony that linked the police to the bombing, along with several witnesses. One thing led to another, and before the year's end, a recall vote ended Mayor Shaw's political career and put Fletcher Bowron in his office. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope I'll see you next time for the second neo-noir classic. This one is a tale about murder, corruption, adultery, racism, and colorful cartoon characters.